Thank you very much, my friend, and thank you for the invitation. And I'm very delighted to be here for what I would call what appears to be an informed audience. And since the introduction has covered the issues, I will only put broad time frames. And we are talking about 100 years of relations. And by the way, this week I completed 40 years of studying Israel. My journey began in 1982, so this is actually a 40th year of my pursuing my interest in Israel. So if you look at the 100 years history, from about 1920 to 1992, what I would call the parallel track, that is that is in the sense zero-sum game. India approached Israel and the pre-state Israel with the view that having a relationship with the Jewish agency and the Zionist movement and Israel is anti-Palestinian. So if you are supporting the Palestinian cause, you have to be anti-Israeli. Anti-Israeli in the sense you cannot even have a normal diplomatic relations. And you recognize in 1950 that the relations had to wait till 92. And India fought wars with Pakistan and China, but that did not prevent New Delhi from having a normal diplomatic relations with both the countries. That was not the case in Israel. That is why you say it's a zero-sum game. That is, your support for the Palestinian cause was reflected by India not talking to Israel. So from 92 to 2014, what I would call the parallel track. India was talking to the Israelis, India was talking to the Palestinians. We were trying to balance the two. So every time there was a visit or contact with Israel, India was making pro-Palestinian state. The third phase began in 2004 when UPA government took office. So during the 10-year period, what was happening was what I would call non-parallel track. That is, India was dealing with Israel as if there is no peace process. And India was dealing with the peace process as if there is no relations with Israel. Meaning, we were criticizing Israel on various issues like borders, settlement, Jerusalem and everything, even while pursuing bilateral relations with Israel. This is almost an antithesis of pre-92 position. Before 92, because of our disagreements with the larger issues, we were not ready to talk to the Israelis. But now, in spite of the differences, we were ready to talk to the Israelis. And that is why you will find India even launching a satellite of Israel, which is supposed to be aimed at Iran. So that was the third phase. The fourth phase began when Prime Minister Narendra Modi took office. That is a rather interesting phase. What he did was, he normalized Israel in India's larger Middle East policy. I think that is a great contribution. Previously, India was dealing Israel as if it is in space. We never dealt Israel within the regional context. And if you look at the statements, Israel figured prominently in our dealings with all the Arab and Islamic countries. But after Narendra Modi took over, Israel became another country in the Middle East. Meaning, you no longer have to keep the bilateral relations under the closet. It is out in the open. And previously, we never had that. And if you look at the 10 years of UPA government, Israelis could not even meet senior officials. The visits were very limited. And most of the contacts were primarily through the Ministry of Defense, nowhere else. And that is the time the Israelis recognize we need to diversify. So under the UPA government, rather than focusing their attention on New Delhi, Israelis began to spread out to different parts of the country. What I would call the decentralization of bilateral relations. While Delhi was important, much more productive engagement was taking place in the state governments. The state governments were governed by different political parties: Congress, BJP, and the regional parties. And Israel found an interesting advantage. In Delhi, the priority was peace process. So what are you doing with the settlements? What are you doing with the Palestinian state? That was a priority in New Delhi. But in the state governments, the priority was economic development, agriculture, water management, farming. They are not interested in the peace process. So the Palestinian state was not the priority of the state governments. They simply say, talk to the South Bloc. With the result, it suited Israel tremendously. Israel was able to reach out to various states of this country based on economic and developmental issues. And therefore, you are developing what I would call a grassroots support for the bilateral relations. The foreign relation was no longer the hobby of a few elites like me, but rather it is directly affecting the population on the ground. A farmer is getting more produce with less number of water. So the agricultural technology of Israel was plunged into Indian rural areas. It also had a political advantage. In the urban elites will talk about boycotting Israel. We will boycott Israeli products, we will boycott Israeli technology, we will boycott Israeli films and artists and everything. The question you have to ask is, are you going to boycott wheat from Punjab grown with Israeli irrigation technology? So therefore, the whole dynamics was changing. So the decentralization not only exposed Israel to state governments, but the state governments are also benefiting from the Israeli technology. But under Narendra Modi, you have a redefinition of strategic partnership. Previously, when you use the word strategic partnership, it is primarily military. What kind of weapons you are supplying, what kind of arms and ammunition. If you read the joint declaration, which was issued when Prime Minister Modi went to Israel in July 2017, military doesn't figure. The most prominent issue was water security. It basically means, tell me, when was the last time you thought water would be a very critical component in foreign relations? And because in the Indian context, it means agriculture, rural development, farming, and GDP, all of them put together. And therefore, what has happened under Prime Minister Modi is a redefinition of strategic partnership. It is not that the military is not there, but the strategic dimensions have changed. And that is visible when Netanyahu came to India the following January. And that is the broad picture. But since it is a national security program, let me also say a few things. The military relations between India and Israel predates normalization. When India was establishing RRU, the senior Indian official was sent to Israel for consultation. And that was done by none other than Mrs. Gandhi. So at one level, you don't have a political relationship. At other level, you recognize this is important for national security. Similarly, whenever India was fighting a war, Indian leaders did not hesitate to contact Israel. This was true for Prime Minister Nehru. It was true for Lal Bahadur Shastri. It was true for Mrs. Gandhi. Whenever there was a crisis, Israel was there in some form or the other from 1962, 65, 71. Even after Mrs. Gandhi's assassination, the Prime Minister's security consulted Israel for what you would call the Black Cat and all the other formation. Some of the weapons used by the elite forces were Israeli made when India was officially not talking to Israel. So Israeli cooperation in the military sector was very much there. Probably General might know more than I do, but the Israeli 67 June war was widely studied in the Indian defense establishment. So therefore, at the one level, you don't have a political relationship. At other level, you are willing to look at various Israeli expertise. And this has become more formal after 92. But it's still, I would say, work in progress, even after nearly 30 years. Because in the initial years, our priority was upgrading the aging Soviet inventories. We did not have the resources to buy new equipments. So therefore, we decided to upgrade the Soviet weapons. That was first priority. The second priority was we decided what I would call cash and carry model. You go and buy weapons and bring it to India. That's the second phase. Much of the 90s and early 2000, that's what happened. And then came a whole range of other issues: counterterrorism, border fencing, intelligence, cybersecurity, and the whole range of issues. And these kind of issues you cannot quantify in terms of money or in terms of the benefits. But what Israel has done over a period of time was raising to the occasion to face a threat. In 1967, suddenly France decided not to supply weapons to Israel. They even refused to supply weapons for which Israel has paid for. And that forced Israel to indigenize the system. If Israel emerges today as one of the top 10 arms exporter, it was primarily because of 1967, the French decision. It basically means, like an individual, nations also start from defeat, not from victory. Victory is a bad teacher, as Vivekananda often says. So the Israelis learned after 67 to redefine their arms industry. And I think that is what it is happening. And there were attempts between India and Israel at a minor level, in the sense, you assembled the Israeli weapons in India. That's still not very promising. The Make in India could be an alternative, but I'm not very sure given our efficiency level. Because we generally, as a nation, we don't walk the talk. What we say and what we do are two different things. It doesn't tally. And I think that is how it is. And cyber security and technology transfers are very, very useful. But we have to remember one thing. No country transfers technology. Let's be very honest. If they transfer the technology to you, which basically means that technology is no longer wanted by the home country. It is obsolete, so I sell it to somebody else. So to expect Israel or any country to sell technology to India is simply an unrealistic proposition. Then what do? You can do two things. One, you can steal. You can steal technologies. There are various means, just like, you download a book without paying for it. There are a million ways you can actually steal a technology. But the drawback is you cannot build an arms industry by stealing technology. You cannot. You can probably learn one or two things. You cannot build your inventory by stealing technology. Therefore, the most efficient way of technology transfer is buying the companies. Outright buying or having a share. I think this is where India should focus on Israel. That is, technological companies in Israel, India should actually invest. You should need a shot, and therefore you actually have a ownership of technology. And this is relevant, especially for cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. Israelis are not going to do that because no country does. Okay. If we look at the Israeli-China behavior in the last 10 years, especially after Netanyahu's tenure, the Chinese-Israeli relations have expanded enormously in the economic realm, not in the military realm. And China is building ports, tunnels, roads, railway system, you name it. The entire infrastructure, China has a great role in that. And the Chinese company, all the major companies have invested in Israeli high-tech industry. And this is creating a problem between Israel and the United States. But for us, what is important is it gives you a model. This is what the model for Israel is. Our advantage is Israel is not very paranoid about India. United States is not very unhappy with Indo-Israel relations. US is more than happy if India joins hands. And this gives us an enormous opportunity for exploration. So the Indo-Israeli relations, merely transaction is gone. Joint research and development is possible, but it has a lot of difficulties because there is an uneven strength. The future will be more about Indian investments in Israeli high-tech industry. Having said that, we are moving in a very new terrain. So far, the relations were bilateral. And two things happened. One, under Prime Minister Modi, we delinked Israel from Palestine. It's a very swift strategic move. Until 2017, all the Indian visitors to Israel also went to Palestine. Foreign Minister Jaswant Singh, S.M. Krishna, and even Sushma Swaraj. Even President Pranab Mukherjee also went to Palestine. So it meant if you want to go to Israel, you have to go to Palestine. And Prime Minister Modi broke that. He broke at two levels. One, in May 2017, just weeks before his Israel trip, he invited the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. And he said that no, India is supporting the creation of an independent Palestinian state coexisting with Israel. What was interesting was there was no reference to East Jerusalem as a capital of a Palestinian state. Until then, for over 10 years, the Indian leaders always talked about a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as a capital. You will find this even a few statements issued under the Modi government before 2017. In 2017, he simply dropped East Jerusalem. And then a few weeks later, he goes to Israel without visiting Ramallah. You know, if you look at the topography of Ramallah, Ramallah is only one side of the road is Jerusalem, the other side of the road is Ramallah, as its outskirts of Jerusalem. He refuses to go. And the following February, he goes to Ramallah without going to Israel. This basically means I'm going to deal with Israel purely on a bilateral level. This is once again in line with an Indian policy. In the sense, we no longer like the Indo-Pakistan hyphenation. Whoever comes to India should come to India. If you want to go to Pakistan, he can go. The most visible example is Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. He comes to Pakistan and then he had to go back to Riyadh. After a couple of hours, he comes back to Delhi. Just to prove a point, there is no hyphenation. And therefore, if India wants other countries to de-hyphenate India and Pakistan, we are also ready to do the same thing. So the de-hyphenation of Israel and Palestine was very clearly demonstrated under Modi. And therefore, when Jaishankar goes to Israel October, he never went to Ramallah. Not only that, if you look at the 5 days, he met scores of officials, lot of statements, the P word was missing, Palestine. And it's a very clear demonstration that we are going to deal with both of them separately. The second dimension is India is integrating Israel in the wider Middle East policy. And that is how I read the Quad. And Quad comprising of India, Israel, US, and Emirates. And people say it's a mini Quad and everything. It is a rather interesting from the bigger one. As much as we know, it is not directed against any third country. I think people tried to bring Iran into the picture. Hindu even carried an editorial. And most of the former diplomats brought in China as a factor. And that if you look at the Israel's relations with China, Emirati relations with China, they cannot afford to join any anti-China forum. It's suicidal for both of them. And it is not against a third country, but it is primarily working towards economic cooperation. If you read the Israeli press, they are talking about other countries joining the forum, including Greece, Egypt, Jordan, and France. So you are thinking of probably, as I argued earlier, you need to look for a different name for this. No longer is going to be Quad because there will be more than Quad. What does it tell you? It tells you India not only is comfortable in dealing with Israel, but it is also cooperating with Israel in third countries. And that is made possible by the Abraham Accord. The normalization of Gulf-Israel relations has opened up new avenues for India. So you no longer have to deal with India bilaterally. You can deal with India at a multilateral level. That is in collaboration with other countries. It has a number of advantages. That is literally sky is the limit. And both Emirates and Israel is cooperating in enormous ways. You read the media yesterday, they announced there is a daily flight from Abu Dhabi to Israel. You know, the number of flights are simply astronomical. And the kind of cooperation they have is huge, especially in science and technology. And we all know that at once upon a time, Abu Dhabi and other countries, other rulers had a large number of personnel from South Asia, mostly Pakistan, for that personal security. I'm thinking that all the personal security will be now governed by automation. And that's why Israel is going to become a very, very heavy player in that. And both are driven towards innovation. And if you look at the Dubai ports, it's one of the massive in the world. And that will be very active in Israel. And therefore, India joining the forum is actually good for India. And it may not be good for the other two countries. For the simple reason, we have a very long gestation period. Time doesn't exist. And you know, if you're familiar with in Hindi, the yesterday is kal and tomorrow is kal. Until the sentence is completed, you don't know what I'm talking about, a past or a future. And therefore, we don't have a sense of time. And now it is difficult for us to work with Emirates and Israel because they wanted it yesterday. That is a slogan. We wanted it yesterday. And therefore, by collaborating with them, we'll have to act faster. I'll just give an example. In 2015, Prime Minister went to Abu Dhabi, and one of the agreement was Abu Dhabi will invest to the tune of $75 billion in India. Ask them how much money has come. And the same thing, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia said, we will invest up to $100 billion in India. How much has come? Because if you look at it, in the Indian system, both the government and the private sector are thinking in terms of small cornerstone behavior, cornerstone. So we don't have a companies of the scale and size which is needed for massive undertakings. And therefore, we need to work. So the Quran conveys the meaning that we not only are out of the crossroad with Israel, we are dealing with Israel more openly, but we are dealing with Israel in a much more confident manner. And once again, it is not we are reacting to a ground reality. You make foreign policy not in abstract level. You react to the ground realities, you are react to the changing dynamics, and you are capitalizing on the opportunities. I think that is what is happening at this point of time. What I will do is I will stop here and open the question. Thank you very much.
So